Thank you, Geert. Geert speaking. Okay, all those Geerts in a meeting, that's a little bit funny, but let's start. Okay, welcome everybody to my presentation. Oops, it jumps in with another screen. Welcome to my presentation. This presentation is about Microsoft Graph, your gateway to Azure and Office 365 resources. In this presentation, I will try to tell my story about the experience I had in a really rather large project, and maybe it can benefit you in the future to build also your application or applications with Microsoft Graph. Geert already introduced me a little bit, but my bio is like this. I work at the company Atheos. It's a joint venture between all energy players in Belgium who is trying to build something that they can talk to each other. A little bit flew of an explanation, but it means that they try to modernize the energy market in Belgium. I work for 45 Degrees. That's a sub-company of the Kronos Group. You see my credentials underneath. Feel free to contact me if you have any questions. If you don't have the time anymore at the end of the session, or you have a rather complex question, you can mail me or contact me via Twitter or LinkedIn. No problem at all. So, like I mentioned before, I rather want to have the questions at the end of the presentation, so I can stick to my time limit that I got. It's a small time limit to talk about a big topic like Microsoft Graph. Microsoft Graph exposes REST APIs and client libraries to access data on the Microsoft Cloud services, and it does that with Microsoft Azure Active Directory that delivers the authorization and the authentication for those REST APIs. It's a tight authorization and authentication, and is served by the Microsoft Identity Framework underneath it. But I will talk a little bit more in detail on that on a later slide. Why do you want to use the Microsoft Graph? Well, you cannot expect that, for example, it's just an example, that users are going to access the Azure portal to retrieve data or to do something with the data. We are in times when we have more self-steering teams that give them access to their team members, or want to deal with their teams channels and so on and so on. You can't expect that every user you have is an avid expert in Outlook, in a SharePoint and whatsoever. So with these tools, you can build simplified applications with the complex nature behind it. At the core of the Microsoft Graph, we have two components. The user, that's the core focus of the Microsoft Graph. The user data is what drives the business. Graph makes this data available to business in the rich context, and you can work with real-time updates and you can make reports with it, but you have to always pay attention that you have the appropriate permissions and don't give your users more permissions than they need. The second component at the core of the Microsoft Graph is the group, and a group integrates with the other services. So it's a tight relationship with the user and the group. A user is a member of the group and can communicate inside of the group. For example, we use in our project the administrative unit and the access packages, where the relationship is user, group, administrative unit, access packages as a base of our applications. And you always see, whatever you do, either it is with Outlook or it is with SharePoint or whatsoever, you always will see that at core, that's the user and the group. That's services and features that the Microsoft Graph exposes, or rather serves to your application. I don't gonna go through the whole list, but for me, the most important one was identity and access management. So you can deal with users or give user teams their own self-steering way of authorizing and authentication of their members. You can access the productivity tools, Outlook and OneNote, or Teams that like we are using now. You can build on top of that, work with it. You have security, and of course, very important, and probably your manager or your director will use the usage reports to see what's happening with all the products you're using in your company. The main components of the Microsoft Graph, because in the past you only had the Microsoft Graph API and everything was built around the Graph API. Today you have, and that's why I call it Microsoft Graph and not Microsoft Graph API anymore. It's a little bit confusing, but we have three main components. The Microsoft Graph API, that's the original way of accessing the data. Microsoft Graph connectors. The Microsoft, that's a new one for the moment, is still in preview. With the connector, you can integrate third-party data indexes in your Microsoft search results. For example, you can index your data specific for your application database. You have a Microsoft SQL Server, you have a MongoDB, you have your MySQL or whatsoever, or even an Azure SQL. You can either it is on-premise or it's in a public or private cloud. You can integrate that data indexes in your Microsoft search results, so you can deliver to your user one product that they can use to search, and that's probably very handy. I didn't use it yet. It's really new, but and I'm not gonna explain it today in detail because if I have to explain those three main components, I probably need 2 days or 3 days to explain it in detail. I will talk mostly about my experience with the Graph API, but I really want to mention also the third component, and is a Microsoft Graph Data Connect. On one side, the Graph API is really to have small batches of and real-time access to data. For example, you want to create a guest user, you want to send a mail, you want to look at all the communication that is being done in a Teams channel, and so on and so on. That's great. There is a Graph API really good for. It's the best fit. But if you want to start making reports and you want to have data from all users that are in a certain administrative unit, and they all their mails that they send to a certain mailbox, that's a lot of data, and for that you can rather use Data Connect, and that in combination, for example, with the Azure Data Factory, and then build your reports in Power BI, for example. That's a really good fit. You have to take in mind that that data is only the cached data. So, for example, you changed or you updated something, a user, for example, that will not directly reflect if you directly after that make reports with the Data Connect. That's something you have to take in mind. So it operates on a cache of data, perfect for batches later on the night, or when you have to make a monthly report or something like that. To give you a little bit a view on what we built with the Microsoft Graph, I made a small reference architecture that is based on our application. Unfortunately, for the people who are not in the .NET world, Microsoft Graph is also for you, but the explanation that I do today is explained on that application, and it's built totally in .NET. But like Bartosz said in his tweet, once you step out of the .NET and start to look at other platforms, you become a better developer. Well, in this case, it means that I don't want to be as narrow as .NET, but for the time being, in this session, it's only so long as we can have it. My reference architecture is like this. We have a React single page application with behind a web app API built in ASP.NET Core, and we communicate with the Graph API to manipulate data in the Azure Active Directory. And we are using the Microsoft 365 to build up some Word documents and send mails, and to look at mails that are being sent to a certain box. For example, when you create a guest user, you get an invitation mails, and so in Microsoft 365 you can see if the invitation mails are being used or not. So before you can start with building your application, you need to register your application and authenticate your application. And you need to do some steps for that. In our experience, it is not really easy. You can struggle with what parameter do I need to add, what steps do I need to take. The documentation is okay, but it can be confusing. And so I made a little bit a step plan with steps that you really need to do before you can actually write your API operations. So for first things first, you need to register your application in the Azure Active Directory. You do that in the step where you see that inside the choices in your Azure portal that you can register your application. You need to choose your application type. It needs to be it can be a web, a single page application, a native application, even a Mac OS or iOS application, an Android application. And a console application, even that, or a Windows application. It doesn't matter. But you need to choose your application type, because then you need to add some extra information, some extra configuration, and with that he can build up all the steps, all the parameters you need to implement it in your application. Next thing you need to do is add the permissions. What you really want to do? For example, I want to read all users, and I want to add access packages, for example, to my users. So I need two permissions. One is read of my user, and the next one is to have the entitlement management, and that's specific for access packages. And I want to do their read write. So you have to specify that in your registration. You need to expose your API, and also there you can say, okay, for example, our client application can only read this API. There's some extra security, so you expose your API and you tell the configuration or the registration that you only want to have a communication with another address, a URL, and so you can specify it over there. And you can also tell in that expose your API which permission the client can have. Can he read the user? Can he update the access packages, or can he only assign access packages to my user? That's something you can deal with that in that step. Last thing, if you don't want to use, you can have different kind of providers, and providers are different styles of authenticate with your application to the Azure Active Directory. And for example, if you don't want to have that the user needs to enter his username and his password, you can create a secret or a certification and add that to your provider, so that the provider can use that to authenticate to the Graph API, and then you can do your API operations. So that's it concerning the application registration. The next step you need to do is implement your application. And there you, of course, you need to reference to the SDK. You need to choose a provider. What kind of app provider do you want? Is it like, do you want to use a simple, straight-on, basic username and password? Or do you want to have with a secret that the user doesn't have to bother with that to authenticate? Or you can use the Microsoft login system or whatsoever. So you need to choose a provider. I think it's about 12 different steps on the documentation. There's in the documentation of the Graph API, you will find a guide to find the right fit for your application. Which provider do you need? And you see that it's a table inside of the documentation. You can see all the information there. to choose your provider. Last thing, of course, you need all the information you set in your application registration. You have to set in the configuration of your application, so your provider can use that to authenticate and to authorize. And of course, if you do all those steps, from that moment on, you can write your API operations. If you're lucky that the authentication authorization is working from the first step, so be careful. It could take some time to get it right. If you have any problem with that, I have a little bit experience with it, and I surely want to help you. You have my credentials, and so feel free to send me a mail or ask me on Twitter. So what you saw in the previous step at the SDK, you have several different SDKs. I talked to you about the ASP.NET SDK, but you also have one for Angular. If you really want to go directly connect with the Graph API from your front end, from your single page application, for example, but also with Java, Python, Ruby, and there's a new one that's created for Go, but also PHP if necessary, or from your mobile application in Android or iOS. So the SDK, it contains two components, the service library and the core library. The service library contains models and request builders. So based on the Graph API, they generated at Microsoft the models and the requests. Well, I will talk about it a little bit more in detail later, how they did it and how you can work with it. And so everything is in that service library, so it's more like your client to access the Graph API. And then next to the service library, you have the core library. It's a set of features that enhance your working. And that means that they have to work with your security or with error handling or whatsoever. They have some basic steps. Also for retry, when a call is failing, they have a retry mechanism or feature inside of the core library. I didn't use it because it's really basic, but if you need some basic feature like that, you can use it from the core library. Next to the SDK, you have also the Microsoft Graph Toolkit. The toolkit is a collection of web components, and it also provided that enables authentication and implementation to acquire your access tokens to call the Graph API. The toolkit is made for web applications. For example, if you want to create something in your Microsoft Teams tab, for a progressive web application, for an Electron application, or a SharePoint web part, and they're also providing some React components if that's your preferred framework. Authentication and authorization. Azure Active Directory is centralized identity provider. In the back, there is no other option than the Azure Active Directory. Based for the client part, the Microsoft Identity Platform is the base of everything. It's used for the authentication and the authorizations. The Microsoft Identity Platform uses three protocols, so the OAuth 2.0, SAML, and OpenID Connect. The OAuth 2.0 is used for the authorization, the OpenID Connect, and the SAML is used for the authentication. The difference between OpenID Connect and SAML is that both you are used, of course, and enables single sign-on. SAML authentication commonly used with identity providers such as Active Directory Federation services. That's something we didn't use related to Azure Active Directory. That's especially made for enterprise applications. And then you have the more simple, and that's what we are used, as the OpenID Connect is commonly used for applications that are purely in the cloud, mobile apps, websites, and web API. So the web API, that's why we used the OpenID Connect. For the authentication, you have to choose your library. So you have here your Microsoft Identity Platform, you have your protocols, but also it's separated from the SDK. So you really have to include both the SDK and the authentication library. The MSAL Microsoft Authentication Library is the standard one, and the MSAL is available for .NET and for JavaScript. And then you have also a Microsoft Server middleware that's for .NET and Node.js, and then Microsoft Identity Platform compatible third-party authentication libraries, and that's more broader selection of options like for your single-page applications, Angular, React, web applications, and you see the rest of the list that I spoke about. All of them are based, of course, on the Microsoft Identity Platform, and it depends on what your requirements are, which one to choose. Yeah, you have your library and you have your provider. You now have everything to really access it. But the most important thing to access it is your access token. From the moment you have your access token, you can choose to use the SDK, but even if you don't want to use the SDK because it doesn't have the features you need, you can simply take an HTTP client, put the access token as a bearer in the header, and you can access the Graph API as simple as that. So for people that doesn't know what getting, I go quickly through the access token. How to get an access token. So the first thing we do is a user from tenant B attempts to sign in with the application. The authorization endpoint requests a token from the application. Then step 2 is the user credentials are required and verified for authentication. Step 3, the user is prompted to provide a consent for the application. So it says, here's a permission, do you want to consent? So that your application can access that via that permission some resources. Step 4 is the Microsoft Identity Platform uses the application object in tenant A, that's where our application is, as a blueprint for creating a service principal in tenant B. And from then on, the user receives an access token, and that access token we can use to make our calls to get our API operations working. So how do you access the Graph API? So we are authenticated, we are authorized to do our steps, we know which permissions we have. We have, for example, we have user, we have an administrative unit, we have an access package, and for example, we also want to send mails through the Microsoft 365 and ecosystem. So what do you really need? Well, to be clear, the access properties of how the Graph API is built, and those are RESTful APIs. The Graph API it's really a Microsoft OData namespace, and an OData is an open data protocol. It's a set of best practices for building and consuming RESTful APIs. It's ISO standard and Oasis standard. So it's really a standard that is used, and it's the version 4 we're using, or not me, but the Graph API is using the version 4. So in the namespace, what does it mean? The Graph API defines most of its resources, its methods, its enumerations as an OData namespace. It's a Microsoft.graph. And the OData metadata is really a machine-readable description of your data model of the APIs. So it enables you really quickly, like for example, you have Swagger is also using OData in the backend and with open data. And that's the same thing, OData, open data. It enables you to create powerful generic clients, proxies, and tools. So, for example, if you want to create your own client for your own language or your framework or whatever, and if you follow the OData standard and use the metadata as your base, it should be easy to create your client. I did a little test with it, and really, if you generate then your client, you can really, for example, in .NET, you can create a basis of your client, and then on that you can build on. But we at the end we use the SDK, but you can do it if you want to, for example, in Go or Rust or your own exotic language or your framework, like if you want to build something in Vue or in Svelte, that's really easy and really possible. So OData namespace does contain our REST API methods. So we need those to from our client to call them and then get the information back that we need. And every REST API method in the Graph API consists of an HTTP method, get, post, put, patch, delete, and so on. A version 1.0 or a beta are the two possibilities. And then the resource, user, administrative unit, group, mail, and so on and so on. And then your query parameters to get specifically a certain user that is in a certain group on a certain date, your filters. And then always every REST API you call, you get a response. And that response also consists out of your status code, 204.4 or whatsoever, or you don't have the permission or whatsoever. And then the response message, either the user that responds to that filter that you build in, and then or something else. And then the last response property is the next link. The next link is added when you have when the required resource supports paging. Only then you get the next link. The next link is the link to your next page. Tools to test, you have two that work great. I prefer Postman. I'm a big fan of Postman, and they build and make better and better tools. Started very simple with Postman, but you can do great testing, automated tests now, and build your own environment. But Microsoft also provides a Graph Explorer, and the Graph Explorer helps you to log in, so you don't have to worry about authorization and get an access token and so on. And it's easy. You just simply log into your user of your Azure Active Directory, and you can test your own API operations at hand. Here, and they give you examples. And you can save them, but that is also something that you can do in Postman. But both tools are available for you if you don't, or if you're not sure which one you need to get your required results. And of course, next to those two perfect tools, you need a reference. And I can tell you the reference is great. It's not complete and it's always changing. So keep it always next to you. And read the reference. It's simple, and from the moment you see you have the click how it is built up, you really gonna find what you need. The reference is split up by resource. It's and if each, like for example, user in a resource, you have first your resource model. Your model with what properties are in the user resource, and underneath the resource actions or operations, list user, create user, and then so on for all the resources you have available. And the last action every time, if it's available, but it's not for every resource, but most of them do have a delta, and a delta is to see what is changed, with the last time. So you give your user that you have in the client user model and to them, and then they will say which or them, not they. The Graph API will say what is changed in the meantime. If you click on one, for example, I've got the get user, create user. So the structure of the document is always the description, the required permissions. So if you're a delegated, that's when you're using the user of the front end instead of your own user. If you are an API on behalf of, is what they call it. You have to use delegated users. So that can be work accounts or school accounts. And so, for example, to create a user, you need a user read write all, or directory read write all, or directly access as a user all. You don't have to have the three permissions, only one is required. And then if you're an application, for example, the API uses the identity provider, he can use the application permission. Then he needs either user read write all or directory read all. Write all. And then underneath you have your HTTP request, the header that is being sent, and then your response, what you can expect when you create a user like this. And then underneath some examples. Most of the documentation do have enough examples. Microsoft is really putting a lot of effort to give you more than enough examples. But my experience is sometimes you really want an example for something and that example does not exist. It's a frustration, but that's the way of life of a developer. Querying. This one is an example. Querying is using the OData namespace, OData querying system. For example, for the GET requests, you can filter your requests. So you can have a subset of your collection. Expanding. So, for example, user, or administrative unit, but I also want to have all the access packages who are assigned to the administrative unit, and I want to have also who is targeting those, who is the target of those access packages. For targets can be groups of users or something else, but I forgot about it, the last one. So there's the relationships and chats you can also put together in one result and get it back. And so the best thing that I can advise for Graph API is do not do a lot of calls after one another. I will show you later that you have to deal with throttling. So if you can get all the information in one call, the better than doing a for each and then retrieving all the access packages. That's not something you want to do because you're going to have a lot of throttling issues otherwise. You can count, retrieve the total count of matching resources, order by, and select if you only want to have certain properties back in your result. And underneath you see some examples of the get HTTP operations. It's a little bit different than you are used to. For OData, spaces are allowed. So for example, here you got, I want to have all users with a given name Joe. So you do that with given name equals to Joe. And underneath, for example, you have another one, give me all access package assignments expanded with the targets. In this case, all the targets, users, for example, or groups, and where I filter on where the object ID is equal to J. That's not correct because an object ID is a unified identifier. So do not use this as an example. You have to put here a universal identifier, not a unified universal identifier. And if you want to use it, if you're old school and you want to use curl or wget or PowerShell tools to get that information, that's possible. If you say, I don't like Postman or I don't like the Graph API tool, you can use in your tool, and but then you have to see that you have ampersand 20, ampersand 20, ampersand 27, and so on and so on. So that's something you have to do yourself with. That's about it. So I talked about a little bit earlier about paging. Graph API does use for big results paging. Obviously, to keep the performance high, because some queries can give you a big response, so it returns in a multiple pages per data. So when it does that, it gives you back your results, and it gives you also a next link property. And in that next link property, it contains your URL to get the next page of your results. So you can use it in your SDK. Or you can use it if you use the HTTP client, or even curl or wget. You can then call again, make your API operation, and then use that next link. considerations, different APIs, different default and maximum page sizes. So you have to take care about that. Different APIs behave differently if you specify a page size. So you need to consult the documentation, what's all about it for some APIs. And not all resources, like I said before, are relationships, support paging. If you use the expand feature of the querying, it can be that it doesn't have paging, or paging is cancelled and you only get a certain result. So you have to take care about that and see what results you get. I talked to you about yeah, if you make a lot of requests, and especially if those requests are concurrent with async await, it can happen that you use concurrent calls. Microsoft Graph prevents that for overuse, and what happens then? Throttling occurs. You get a response with 429 as the status code, and that's, if you look up on the internet, that's equal to too many requests. And in the response header, it gives you back the Microsoft give you how long you have to wait before you can call again. And it's very handy because if you use a tool like Poly that exists for C# or .NET or Node.js, Poly is a resilience and transient fault handling library. In particular, the retry policy. And I have an example on the side here where I define a policy, and you can see in the second example that I do a get server wait duration. So I get back how long do I have to wait, and with the poly retry policy, it waits and then it tries again. In this case, it's 3 times, but every time he retries, he logs a warning that he had to retry, which retry attempt it is, how long he does have to wait, and then so on and so on. And it's simple as that. You can get it from the header. In .NET, you have the HTTP response headers, and it does have the property retry after you, so you get it. If it doesn't exist, you give it back 0 and you retry. And then a little calculation, feel free to copy it, and you can use it with the retry policy. My experience working with this retry policy together with the Saga pattern, it works great. If you have to do a lot of steps, for example, you need to create a user, and then you need to create a mail, and then you need all those steps, I can advise you to use the Saga pattern. Look up in the Microsoft Azure Microsoft Azure architecture documentation, document center it is called. There is a really good article about Saga pattern. Read it and implement it, and you will enjoy developing together with the retry policy. We did not use, like I said before, the retry mechanism that is included in the core part of the SDK. It's not versatile and flexible enough like using the Poly, because Poly can do a lot of different stuff, but then I will explain it in another session maybe. So Geert, there is a new session ID about Poly, especially when you want to use it together with the Saga pattern. Notifications. If you use the Azure portal and you want to create a resource, a virtual machine, an app service, or whatever, you create and you click on the button at the end and you say, create it for me. It takes time. And you see in the top right corner, okay, and you see a spindle, or it's not a spindle, it's a progress bar. I don't know what it is, but how do you call it? But you see that it is in progress, and it takes time. Sometimes it's 10 seconds, sometimes it's 1 second, sometimes it's a minute, 2 minutes. It depends. And so that's the same nature you have in the Graph API. Luckily for us, they provided notifications for us. So when you create something, and you subscribe to the notification system of the Graph API, you can wait for the notification, and the Graph API will send it back to you, and then you know that for sure something is actually created. Very handy if you want to create a user, for example, or a group, and you want to work with that user or that group. You really want to know if it's actually created, because if you create it, you directly get a response, and that doesn't mean that it actually is created yet. But only on a limited set of resources. Unfortunately, you have to look up in the documentation we used for the user and the group creation, updating, and deleting. Subscription on all resources of a certain type, so you can say if something happens to one of the users, it doesn't matter which user, send me a notification. That's possible, or you say, I create my user and I want to know when that user is created. So you can specify that subscription notification subscription with a specific filter. To create a notification, you need to have the permission of that resource. So for the user, you need to be able to read that user. The security validation, you gives the security between your application and the Graph API is a validation token. So when you create a subscription, you get a validation token back, and that validation token you need to keep with you. And then when the Graph API sends you a notification, you can verify if that validation token is equal to the one you have. So you're sure that it is not a stranger that tries to mess up your application. Unfortunately, you can't, your notification post action that you need to build so that the Graph API can send you something to let you know that something is created. That notification post operation or action cannot be secured. That's for the time being. I don't know if Microsoft is planning to give you a certain system that you can give you an access token, and then it will send back that access token, and you can verify it. But for the meantime, they give you a validation token. It's not that secure, but it's already something that is secure. How did we implement it? This is how we implemented it. We used the Azure Signals R server as our way to notify our clients. So, for example, in this one, and I'm looking at my time, but I will try to explain because this system works really great. And if you want to have more information about it, feel free to contact me, and I'm gladly to explain it to you by mail or in a Teams meeting. So feel free to contact me. So my client, before he can do something, he needs to negotiate through the notification hub that you build up. And I will explain notification of why it is there. You need to negotiate with Azure Signals R server that you can have a connection. When the Azure Signal R server through the notification hub says everything is okay, step 2, and then it goes back to step 1, it gives back to the client a connection ID. That connection ID you can give to every API operation of your web API. So in this example, my API action operation is change user. If I want to do that and I want to be notified, I have to give in my request body, in my implementation, that connection ID. So that connection ID will be given in step 5 with a subscription to the notification system, and that notification will keep everything, sees for all changes that's happening in the Graph API or in the Graph resources. So that's done, and then when I update the user will be updated in the Active Directory in top layer, And then the user, from the moment that it's actually created, will trigger the notification. The notification will send a request to step 8 to my change notification API action. My change notification API action will go to step 9, send to the clients. It says it will send a notification to the Azure Signal R server. Please, Azure Signal R server, this is my message that I want to send to the client that the user is changed. And the Azure Signal R service will go through the step 10, that is also any persistent connection, send that message to the client, and you can show it to the client. Says, okay, client or user, my user is changed. What is a notification hub? Is included in the API, as a client cannot negotiate with a Signal R service directly in our system to keep it secure. Because you cannot, there is a way to secure your Azure Signal R server through connection strings. And that connection string you can put in the Azure Key Vault. But we did it like this through a notification hub. And that with that notification hub, we use the same security as what is set in the API on its own. So we use the same way. The client needs to log in, otherwise he can't use that API, and it has an access token, so we can use the same access token for the notification hub. And so we can control the connection, see that the notifications are not sent to the wrong client, but also that strangers cannot use our system or that way of connecting to our client and send bogus messages. Notifications. There is a something disadvantage. Azure Signal R server is not for free. You can use the Signal R that is delivered for free with ASP.NET that is integrated in your web API, but scaling is difficult. What happens if you're using you're sitting in a cluster or using multiple instances? I don't know exactly what's happening. So scaling is difficult. What we are going to use in the future in our next application for the Graph API, where we have to send a lot of notifications, because now it is a small batch of notifications that we are sending. In our next application, we are having to send more than 1,000 notifications per minute. We're going to use the Azure Event Hub together with an Azure function. And we are sure then that it is more secure, because we can have a security line between our client or web API or Microsoft Graph, and then go through the Azure Event Hub that picks up that notification. We don't have to create our own change notification in our web API. So Event Hub will pick up that notification and sends it to our Azure function. And our Azure function that has a secure line between the Azure function and the Azure Signal R server is already implemented and is provided by Microsoft. And then Azure Signal R server will provide a tight connection with the client. Next step is to remove also the notification hub, and that will be great, but that's the next step, and that everything is being done by an Azure function, so that an Azure function also communicates with the client to establish the persistent connection with the Azure Signal R server, and that so that the Azure function will provide the connection ID. Accessing the SDK. I have to go a little bit faster because it's only 9 minutes left. Sorry about that, I'm talking a little bit too much, but feel free to ask me any questions about this one. This is an example about the configuration, how to configure your API. So the left one is what you put in your app settings, and on the right part you see what a configuration you need to do in your startup of your API. And then next thing is an implementation, how we're using repositories with a dependency injection. Above that we use CKRS with commands and queries with the mediator tool or library, mediator library. How we implemented it, so we're using a factory And why do we use a factory? So we can give back a graph service client. A graph service client is the client that we make a connection with the Graph API as a C# developer. In this example, for example, is we want from the users, we want all users that correspond to the certain email address or a user principal name. So probably only one. Oh yeah, only one. Not probably, it will be only one because email address is unique. You can only register a user with one unique email address. Why did we use a factory? So we can give back different kinds of graph service clients. For example, on behalf of the front-end logged in user, or API want to use its own user to do certain actions. So you can divide the permissions that the front-end user can have and the permissions that the API can have, so that the front-end user only can do, for example, can only see information of itself and can't see any other information from other users, but the API can see all information. Options are open. And we want to give it back, or you can give back HTTP clients. Here's another example, more complex C# SDK example. And I wanted to show you this one. So the graph service clients, you can get out the authentication provider, and with that authentication provider, you can associate an HTTP client, so you can directly call the REST API. And why do you want to do it? Well, there are some features in the beta that are not in the 1.0 features version, and they advise you not to use the beta SDK in production. But that doesn't mean that you, as a developer, cannot use those REST APIs that are not available in the 1.0 version. So, but those you can access with the HTTP client and then use it like this. And so you don't have to include the beta SDK. One more, and unfortunately, time is almost up. Caching. We experienced that the API is a great tool, but it is slow. Slow by nature, and because it is not only because it's an asynchronous environment, but also it is slow if you want to have a lot of information. And you can use Data Connect, but Data Connect, it doesn't give you the up-to-date data. So the only thing you can do for information, like I want to keep the list of all groups that I have, all administrative units and or other information, you can use caching. We used a cheap solution for this application, but the next one will be different. I will show you what we're going to use in our next application. The cheap solution is to keep a background service with the memory cache where all your objects could communicate to get your necessary data, and then you can use Delta queries to keep everything up to date, and you can use a notification in combination with Delta queries to keep also everything up to date. The options are open. The thing is, then, if you're using a cluster or you're using multiple instances of your services, then you're going to have different memory caches, and that's not okay. Here an example, our solution for caching, you can see afterwards how we did it. So it can give you a little bit of an inspiration. But in the future, we're still considering Redis or Memcache, the cloud version, or maybe a caching proxy, but that's a big question mark. I wanted to explain everything, but a great example that you can find is to implement what is in the Azure Architecture Center. There is a great article about caching. I've included the URL to that article. Read it. It gives you a little insight how you really make a robust application. And I think my preference is, if we need to be sure that we do not lose any information from cache, I will use Redis, and otherwise it will be Memcache, but it's not decided yet. But that article is applicable on both products. Last slide. Thank you already for all your attention. I'm so sorry that I don't give you any room for a lot of questions. Feel free to send them in Teams later on, and I will answer them as quickly as possible. But anyway, maybe a minute or two. Best practices. Use the reference, but keep a fresh copy of the SDK source not so far away. My experience in 7 months working with the Graph API is don't always believe what is in the documentation. Sometimes it gives you a different result than what you expected. Open the source. It is available on GitHub and look how they build it. And then you're going to see sometimes some surprises. So I've always one open. And if it doesn't really work, I reference that SDK source and then I can step in, or I use other diagnostic tools inside of Visual Studio. If you have Visual Studio or Rider or whatsoever, or another tool, it's really something I can give you as advice. Keep that source not so far away. The JavaScript source is also very good. Check the changelog regularly. If you're using version 1.0 with the HTTP client with the extra REST API calls that are not included, the changelog is something you have to look into. Use a correct component for the scenario. You know that the performance is really not optimal. I hope they will do something in the future about it. Be careful with the permissions. It's so easy to give something a permission that is not needed, and it's easy to forget that you gave that permission. And to have a robust application handle the expected HTTP errors, not only throttling, but also the other errors. Thank you for your time. Here, do we have, now we have 1 minute. That's a little bit too.
Yeah, we have one question from Alexander. You can see it in the chat. Would Graph then be something similar as System Directory Service LDAP namespace in .NET for accessing AD?
It's a follow-up. The Graph that's all from the past. In the past you had Azure Active Directory API and an Active Directory API to access your Active Directory data. They all put together everything in Graph API. So they want to make one gateway for all information. So if you use System Directory Service in the past, do not use it in the future anymore. Use the Graph API. If you're not on, if you're on premise, then you can still use System Directory Service. Okay.
Okay, good. Thank you.
I think if you have any question left, feel free to contact me. I do make time for that. Or if you want to score some points on Stack Overflow, put it on Stack Overflow and send me the link, and I will answer it if you want that. That's okay for me. The same, if you, I think here you put it on YouTube. You can put it inside of the comment section of your YouTube as well. Thank you for your time, everybody. And I hope to see you again on Tech Train, but it will not be me, and the next time it will be somebody else. Thank you. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.